Well, it's my great honor to welcome Deryck Stokes, who was CSM 1 Commander, a fellow RLI man. And Deryck, thank you so much for giving us your time to do this talk. It's early morning where you are in the UK, and it's late afternoon where I am in the Philippines. But we connected, and we've got comms on this meeting.
Yes.
So thank you so much, sir, for your time. Deryck, I'm going to hand over to you. You've got quite an interesting history, so why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Okay. Well, first of all, John, thank you very much for having this chat with me. The main purpose of my chat is to establish some sort of legacy for my progeny for the future. So, because one always has time with your kids, but you only get little bits of your story because they're all distracted with others and whatever. So you can never tell them the whole story. So they get bits and pieces all jumbled up over the years. So this does really, it's magnificent in getting your legacy to them, so that they all get a common understanding of where you're coming from.
Absolutely.
In other words, what did you do in life, Daddy, or what did you do in the war, Daddy, or Grandpa, or anything like that. And then, of course, when you pass on, it's always there for somebody to see. So it's a nice legacy to leave.
Absolutely.
The other thing I'd like to bring up quick, if you don't mind, John, I think that this is a marvelous program, and I would encourage others that view this program to actually contribute to the maintenance and the equipment and whatever for the program, because I think you really start getting a picture of actually what did happen and how common our lives really were right up until the end of the Rhodesian era. So I would encourage others to. I've made a donation myself as an example, so I'm not just speaking to get others to pay when I'm not prepared to do it myself. So please do support John and all his efforts.
Thank you.
The other thing, okay, well, to start with, I would just like to give you a brief resume on where I come from, because to understand what I did is you need to know where you come from. And I'm sure my story is very, very similar to a lot of Rhodesians. I was born in the UK in 16 June 1949. I'm the youngest of 4 children. My mother was in the war. She was a Wren, and she was working very much with the decoding and the SOE. And she did fly into the fields of France in Lysanders at night on short takeoff and landing strips and so on. So she used to deal with ciphers and codes and radios and broken radios for the resistance in France. So she was a very, very brave woman. And obviously, she also came from in the UK, a middle high class background. My father was an able-bodied seaman during the war. His minesweeper was sunk in the Pacific Ocean near Singapore. He was on a raft for 10 days in shark-infested waters, but they were lucky to be rescued. He was demobbed from the Navy, like a million other men. And they came back to a UK that was totally broke. Women had taken over most of the production and manufacturing jobs while the men were overseas. They came back and there was just no jobs. So he had to go out and get what he could find. And so we moved from my birth town of Broadstairs, and we moved to Salisbury in Wiltshire in the UK. My grandfather, at the end of the war, became wheelchair bound from arthritis. So he was advised by his physician to go to a warmer climate. So they took off to the then Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, and they went to southern Rhodesia and bought a farm in Mucheki on the entirely Salisbury Road, as Rhodesians will know where Mucheki is. They bought a farm so he could be in. At the same time, my uncle Peter was demobbed from the RAF and came to Rhodesia and joined the RRAF, the Rhodesian Air Force. And he, at weekends, helped manage the farm in Mucheki.
I believe the ship that your father was in was called the Aurora.
Yeah, HMS Aurora.
And that your sister is, your eldest sister is named Aurora after the
Correct.
ship.
Yeah. Typical sort of military guy, finding something in his past to carry his legacy somewhat.
Yeah.
That's good. That was a good spot. Anyway, the point was my uncle went to the farm, but he, as a sport, he used to do sidecar racing, and during this time, we were still in the UK, but my grandparents were on the farm, and he was unfortunately killed in an accident at Glam Stadium in Salisbury. So he never got to see the war because he would have been quite high up in the RRAF if he had survived. But unfortunately, because of his demise, my grandparents gave up the farm. But we didn't know that, and they had already sent an invite to my father and my mother to come and join them in southern Rhodesia, knowing their predicament in the UK. And at that stage, the UK government was offering incentives to pay for trips to the colonies to relieve the labour problem in the UK. So my parents decided to take my grandparents up on the offer, and the government paid our fares to go from the UK to southern Rhodesia, which my father selected for some reason. We could have gone to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, to name a few. But he decided on southern Rhodesia because he actually had a job to go to as manager on the farm. So, because my grandparents were elderly and my grandfather was disabled, so it was seemed a good sort of future for him, and take him out of the doldrums he was in, which actually drove him to drinking a lot more than he used to. I mean, British sailors were known for their rum and whatever, but his was a little bit more than that. Anyway, we got on the SS Kenya, and we traveled around the Bay of Biscay, through the Mediterranean, through the Suez Canal, and it took us 6 weeks to get from Southampton to Beira, down the east coast of Africa. And we stopped off at various places like Aden, and that was my first encounter with a black man, because we went ashore on the boat, and there's a black boy. He was probably in his teens, and I noticed he had short, curly black hair. And I questioned my mother, and I said, "Did the people here burn their hair to get it like that?" And she had to then explain to me where we were going, and this is what the population we were going to encounter. So the first time I came across a black person was when I was about 7 years old. So we had a marvelous time on the ship. It was like a big holiday for us, because we had a swimming pool, we had 5 meals a day, and it was really grand. And the warm weather was just up our street. As kids, we were in the pool round the deck and going fishing with the Goan crew at the back of the ship, where they used to fish when they weren't on shift. So it was a marvelous time. Anyway, we got to Beira, and it was hot and balmy and whatever. We got chowed by mosquitoes for Africa before we even got off the blooming ship. They must have flown a long way. Anyway, when we got off there, we got a message, and I don't know how my father got it, but we got the message that my uncle had been killed, and that we were not to get off at Macheki station on, through the Beira corridor through to Salisbury. So we carried on overnight, and we got to Salisbury late the next day, where we were picked up by my grandparents in their big car, and went to live with them until we found a place of our own. We found a place of our own, but my father then had this job hunting again. And of course, then in southern Rhodesia, painters were at the very worker level thing, which that sort of level where real labor level, which white people didn't take on. Those sort of jobs were reserved for the black people. I'm not saying that on any racial connotation, but that's the way it was, because the black people were still developing themselves and whatever. But the point being, that didn't help, and he took to drink and got violent, and eventually my parents got divorced. My brother and I were, elder brother and I, were awarded wards of the state. So the state, because my mom was left with 4 kids, so she was prepared to look after the 2 older girls. They were my 2 older sisters. But my brother and I became wards, and we were asked which school we wanted to go to, because at that stage we were at Selborne Rutledge in Salisbury. Then we were either Marandellas or Sonoya. So we chose to go to Sonoya at primary school level for 2. I had still 2 years to run at Sonoya Primary, and my brother and I decided to go there. And then over long weekends and holidays, we used to get on the railway bus to travel on the strip road from Sonoya to Salisbury. Sonoya was a mixture of people from unfortunate circumstance, family backgrounds like me, but also a whole lot of farm boys. And the farm boys were Afrikaans boys, mainly. So we fought the Boer War all over again at Sonoya Primary School. So we were in lots of fights in the dust in our khaki brook and shirts and whatever. But it was part of growing up, I suppose. I then came to the time for high school, and the natural thing is for us to go from the primary school to the high school, which had just been built. I joined in the first year after it had been built, and I went to Stewart House for 1 year, and after that was shipped off to Norman House, which was an experimental where the sleeping and the living quarters were separate, but the dining and prep facilities were mixed with the girls and the boys. So the 2 houses could mix in the dining room. And because it was a co-ed school. And that worked out quite well. They had many a laughable circumstance over smoking or whatever. I was just on smoking alone. I was caught 17 times. I had 17 6 of the best, and I had to plant 17 trees. I went back there 15 years later, and my trees were proudly there between Norman and Stewart House on the road to the school itself. So, and they're nice and tall, and they're strong. So I planted them well. And the amusing part was my last tree, I was sitting at the bottom of the hole that I dug. It had to be 4 by 4 by 4 feet, and supervised by the groundsman, Mr. Marilia. And I was sitting at the bottom, and I decided to have a cigarette. And next thing, I saw the shadow looming over me. And guess who it was? It was the headmaster. And we called his nickname, his name was Talbot Evans, but his nickname was Snave. And Snave looked down at me, and he said, "Some people never learn." And that was tree number 16. Tree number 17 came the same day. I was planted the same day. So I had a hard time learning, but that was my second home. I treated the headmaster. He was like my father to me. He was very, very good, a good man. and the teaching staff and everything were good at Sonoya. We were required to play 2 sports in summer and 2 winter sports as part of the education curriculum, not like it is nowadays, where nobody really, certainly in the UK, hardly anybody ever plays sport at school. But in our school, and like most Rhodesian high schools, sport was actually compulsory. It was part of your education. So I played rugby and water polo, first team. Cricket, I was posted out to the boundary, and that's where I stayed. They wouldn't let me anywhere near the crease to bat or bowl. But I was quite happy with that. That was my first summer sport. The other one was cross country, which I participated in the annual schools competition at Peterhouse. So those were my days at high school. I was at high school for 5 years because I decided after 4 years, I got my O levels. But I decided I should stay on and get my M levels, which gave me entrance to a South African university, not British. I would have to get A levels for that if I wanted. But I had no intention of going anywhere except Rhodesia or that part of the world. I didn't even think about it. So I just did my M levels anyway. I managed to get the 3 that I wrote. But then came a problem when we were all 17 years old in my vintage, because we all applied for jobs just before the end of 1966. We all applied for jobs, and we got a lot of no's or declines because I applied for a job. The one I really wanted was on the Shamba mine, northeast of Rhodesia, northeast of Bindura, on the Shamba mine as a trainee assayer. It was a gold mine. And that mine started many years ago, where the miners came up very on the early 1800s. They came up and opened the mine, and they made a lot of money from it. They bought the land around the mine and became farmers. And that's what happened to my new family, because my mother remarried a man, a farmer from Shamba. So our holidays were spent on the farm in Shamba, school holidays. Anyway, so after my matric, we had this problem because we couldn't get jobs. So what we all decided, while we were fit and everything from rugby or whatever, that we should all volunteer for our national service. And I just want to change tack here a bit, because a lot of people looked at Rhodesian as national service being conscription. But most of the guys that I know of that went to national service volunteered, because the companies didn't want to make up your pay, because it was a government law that they had to get, if they employed you and then you did national service, they'd have to give you make up pay. So they would prefer at that stage, which was national service was 9 months. They said, well, do your national service and contact us again, and we'll relook at your application for employment. Yeah. So on January 1967, we all congregated. There was probably about 15, 20 of us from Sonoya High School that met at the station on the way to Heaney Junction outside Bulawayo to depot Rhodesia Regiment to start our national service. And we had a few beers on the way down. And by the way, my mom gave me, all I started my new career was I had my school blazer with my badge cut off of it, unpicked. So I had that as a blazer, and my mom gave me £2 because Rhodesia had pounds then still, Southern Rhodesia. Gave me £2 and a tin of kiwi polish and a brush, and that was my total kit to go to thing. That was where my life started, really. My working life started. So I wasn't given any silver spoons at all. Anyway, we arrived at Heaney Junction, and there was, can I mention names here? There was Sergeant Clemo, Tiny Clemo, Sergeant Clemo, with his red sash, bawling at us to get off the train. Probably about 300 guys off the train. Some with Chelsea boots and long hair and flared pants and whatever. But there was the clever guys from the who were pre-warned or had the initiative, were there ready for anything, because we knew that we were going to be called everything under the sun and doing everything. So Tiny Clemo said, right, you see those trucks there? Put your bags, throw your bags into the back of the truck. So if you had a suitcase, whatever, you chucked in the back of the truck. And then the trucks drove off. And Tiny Clemo said, just follow the dust. And he said, you've got half an hour. So here we had to run all the way in this dust behind the trucks, all the way from Heaney Junction to Llewellyn Barracks. So that was our initiative, and that was Tiny Clemo. And you know what? I vowed and declared that if I ever got into that position, that Tiny Clemo, I was going to do the same thing. And guess what? I did. That was later on. Anyway, so we did our national service and we did our basic training. And then, of course, the sounds of war, drums were beating. And there was a lot of concentration on getting recruits from national servicemen into the regular army. So the SAS and the RLI, especially the RLI, because most of the instructors were not service corps guys anymore. They were actually RLI guys, sergeants and senior NCOs that were that trained at Llewellyn. So I was in intake 83 from January, and I did my basics, and then I went along to have a look and see what the regular army was all about, because we still weren't certain whether we were going to have employment.
Yeah.
But somehow we were convinced, and most of the 15 or 20 of us that went down there actually joined up into the army together. So we kept the same vintage together. I mean, it was quite fantastic, because we were never alone or outside. There was always somebody you knew to cry on their shoulder after running around that bloody airstrip at teenage DRR because you didn't do your drill movement properly or something like that. Anyway, I think we were called maggots and everything. So that was my rank.
Yeah, at this stage, your rank was apparently shark shit.
Yeah, shark shit. Yeah, lower than shark shit. But there was one thing about national service, you know. It was a tremendous leveler, because you got the hoity-toity guys and the real unfortunate poor guys, and military service actually brought them all together to one level.
Yeah.
And it's surprising how that broke the boundaries of class distinction, which was an exceptionally good thing, because obviously you had to have cohesion after training, especially in a war situation. So you couldn't have us and them situation. So that was one magnificent thing about national service. It actually did that. Having M levels, I was at my interview to go to the RLI, at the RLI major. I've forgotten who it was, but it was in the big hall they had there, the big sort of lecture hall. And he said I should go on Osby, which I did, and I got a fail watch. And Dave Parker, Colonel Dave Parker, was actually the officer, the chairman of the officer selection board. And he was the one that turned around and said, well, you're only 17 years old, give yourself a chance here. So they gave me a fail watch, which means I could apply later on and come back. You know, it wasn't a total fail. It was just, you're not ready for that. He said, go and and sort yourself out in the RLI first, and then we'll see later. So that was the end of my national service, because I was shipped off then to Salisbury, and we were sent to training to RLI, and we joined a squad in training troop, which Ronry Daly was the training troop commander at that stage. He had just finished off as RSM, and Robin Tarr had taken over. And we joined a course that had also done their first phase, basics. So I only did an RLI recruit course for, I think, about 2.5, 3 months. So I passed out as a trooper in sort of April, beginning of May. And the amusing part was that we got told in the lecture room after the passing out parade that we'd all been selected to go to motor transport, MT troop, under Captain Dyer. I was so disappointed. I really, really became vocal in the lecture room, and I thought I was going to be in serious trouble, because I said I had come to fight a war, not to drive some armchair warrior around Salisbury. So I wasn't exactly popular right at the beginning. But as we came out the lecture room there, we were told to grab our kit. And lurking in the bushes was Major Peter Rich, who was the OC of one commando. And he lifted his finger and shouted, you, and you, get here now. And of course, we rushed over there and saluted and did all the right things. And he said, get your kit and get onto my Land Rover. It's parked there at the front. So we did exactly that. And he drove us up to one commander, and he said, right, here we go. And I was posted. He told me straight away, you're in 2 troop, 1 commander. And I thought, I'm going to be in trouble for this. And I believe later on, we never heard a thing about it afterwards, but there was quite a to-do between Captain Dyer and Major Peter Rich for stealing recruits. Because at that stage, in 1967, 2 troop consisted of 5 people. It was Fani Kutsia as the troop commander, Jerry Oosthuizen as the troop sergeant, and I'd forgotten who the corporal was, but anyway, there was 2 troopers, me and this other guy. And that was the total figure. When we actually got muster parade every morning, you see these ridiculously small groups all standing apart in their troop areas, 1, 2, 3, and 4 troop at that stage. And I thought Jeepers was, a bit short of guys here. Anyway, it actually stayed like that. But they obviously realized that there was a need to do something about this. But there wasn't even a suggestion that we take in national servicemen. It was a regular unit, and they would only take people that were willing to sign up for three years at that stage.
Can you remember your service number?
Yes, 724100. One commander had the first contact on the Nyakasanga Bridge near Chirundu,
Yes.
the Nyakasanga on the way to A Camp.
That was with Second Lieutenant Trevor Des Fountain.
That's right.
And I believe Trooper Boddington was wounded in the arm.
Here is the original contact report given to me by Lieutenant Colonel Trevor Des Fountain. And if you'd like to read it in detail, then I suggest you just pause the video at each page and watch through it. It's incredibly interesting. Including here is coming up a diagram of a map of the actual contact, and signed by Army HQ. If any of you are interested in this, I can email it to you. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, that was big. That was big news all the way around. And the SAS had a encounter in a Pantechnicon on the Chirundu Road near Makuti and so on. So, I realized that I'd only joined the commando a couple of days just a couple of days after that. A couple of days before that, because we were based at the sugar estates in Chirundu when Trevor was having that contact on the Nyakasanga, near the Nyakasanga Bridge. And that became a troop area. And we ambushed this Nyakasanga bridge, and everybody knew that that was an ambush position. So how secret it was, I don't know. But eventually we realized that we should actually change this. But it was obviously an area that had been scouted for a crossing point.
Was that what was that one troop?
That was one troop had the contact.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was with two troops. So I missed out on that. And there was quite a lot of jealousy. I think we all would have liked to been there and been wounded and come back and brag about it. It was really quite slow, border control for a few months. And then I got sent off to do a outward bound course in Malseta, which was basically run by a civilian organization. And it involved a whole lot of mountaineering, rock climbing, abseiling, orienteering, all those outdoor activities, swimming in cold rivers and exploring and whatever. And initiative training like they had on Osby, where you would do all these fancy tasks with a group of people and to pull out leaders and things like that. I had a wonderful occasion. One of the funniest occasions I had is we were on the way to Bridal Veil Falls that had hardly been discovered. It wasn't a very well populated area. And I walked around this mountain trek and came across a massive baboon. I couldn't go up or down because it was sheer up and down, and nor could he. He wanted to go where I was standing on the ledge, and I wanted to go the other way. And it was a shouting match between me and the baboon, probably about 4 or 5 feet separating us. Anyway, eventually he decided to give way, but he was the biggest baboon that I'd ever seen, probably because it was up close and personal. Anyway, he took off, thank God, because I thought, here we go, I'm going to get mauled here. But that was the funny, to me, that was quite an hilarious instance. And all the other, I had civilians in me, bankers and doctors and whatever, and they just laughed like hell. They said it had to be one of the army guys that got into that situation. Anyway, it so happened that when I got back from that, I did very, very well. I actually got a distinction on my course because, we did debating in the evening, by the way, and things like that. So we did a lot of chess playing and that, like a lot of evening activities as well. Your first activity in the morning was run down to what they call Tessa's Pool. And Tessa's Pool, if it didn't have ice on it, you were bloody lucky because you had to swim from one side to the other. That was your wake up call, and you certainly woke up after diving into that. But anyway, it was par for the course. Anyway, I did quite well. I got a distinction, and I think his name was Bill Bailey, the manager of the school. He recommended that I come back as an instructor on future outward bound courses. And it was about 3 months later, and I got called back. Peter Rich called me and he said to me, "You're going back as an instructor." And I went back there and I bumped into John Britton, who's Rhodesian Air Force. He was also an instructor. He'd also got called back as an instructor there. And I was given a patrol called Tandai, and I did 2 courses as an instructor on Outward Bound. At the end of 67, I got back and I was promoted to Lance Corporal. And I'd only been in the army for less than a year. And I thought, wow, this is quite good. Anyway, they obviously saw some sort of qualities, leadership qualities in me. So I was a Lance Corporal. Then we had probably about 10 people in the troop. We hardly ever saw our troop commander, which was part of the course. They were always doing courses and things like that. So ours was basically run by Jerry Ustays. And Jerry, very, very good man, good NCO. And Jerry had a stutter. And an amusing thing is that a senior NCO from the commander had to take us for drill now and again onto the drill square to keep us in line and to keep our discipline and whatever. and we were marching around the drill square, RLI drill square, and Jerry got into one of his stuttering split, and he couldn't tell us to about turn. So he's going left, right, above, above, and we were marching into the gum trees next to the thing, and the RSM was standing on the parade square, and he was shouting at Jerry Westay, "Sergeant, where are you? Your people going?" Shame. I felt so bad for him, but we all took it as a fun and a joke, and the RSM was actually only mildly. That was a Robin Toy. He was only mildly upset. It wasn't another year later, in I think it was 1968. I was promoted to corporal, and I was shunted off to the School of Infantry to do a drill and weapons course, which was part of the junior NCO's training, a part of his career at the school. I managed to attain a C+, but if there's anything I hated in my life, it was drill. At this stage, I must tell you that I joined the army to fight. I wanted to be in the front lines all the time. I didn't want to be where I was put and bashing around the parade square in Guello and whatever with being screamed at. Anyway, I somehow got a C+, which was a pass, but it wasn't brilliant, but it was a mediocre pass. And that's basically all I was required to do. But I got promoted. I was a corporal. I was actually even called back a few months after that again to instruct on a drill and weapons course myself. So, I couldn't be that much. I love the weapons phase, but the drill phase, sorry, we need to go back a little bit to Op Cauldron at the end of 1967, when I was a lance corporal. Cauldron was the first big bash where 3 Commando at Dean's Camp, and we were up on the escarpment, and my first clash with the Turs was in an ambush on the fly-fits with Fonny and Jerry and all the guys, and this one gook came walking into our ambush, and I can even remember the flare going up, and Jerry Ustays saying to him, "Inuina, something about, what are you doing in Rhodesia? Inuina Enza, Lapa Rhodesia." That's what he was saying. Inuina. And I thought, yes, that's a strange thing with this flare going up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and here's this goo. I said, why aren't we shooting? Anyway, we wanted to capture, but we got a capture. And the next day, of course, now we're all full of cock a hoop, and we're driving down the fly fence, and there comes this apparition rushing out of the bush, and he's shouting, "Ara, ara, 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 ara." It was actually an RLI soldier who had got separated from his platoon down the road, and we nearly shot him because we were all hyped up thinking now that we'd got one, but there was millions around us. So he was very lucky that he was managed to shout and put his hands in the air and shout, "Ara, ara, ara, ara," and get it out fast enough. Anyway, we took him home. So that was the best of my Cauldron days. Yeah, we were given the Kachuta track in Centenary to ambush, and we did have a contact where these Turs walked up there. They weren't even looking around. They were all had these packs on that had straps of tree bark, string and whatever, digging into their shoulders. They just weren't interested in the war. And we managed to shoot 3 of them, I think, and one of them. And that was my first contact as an NCO. Then we went in 1970. We got onto Op Birch, March 1970.
Right.
And that was when Nigel Henson had got information from a storekeeper about these guys, and they followed up. They had a contact. And then 2 Troop under Bruce Snellgar, overnight, we got put into stock groups. I was a stock group commander with 3 other guys, and he was patrolling the bottom down at the Hanyani area. We had steep hills. The hills were if the Chimani Manis was steep, then Hanyani was equal to that. So Bruce and his guys followed up, and they walked straight into an ambush. In fact, they walked straight on, virtually on top of these 3 or 4 tours, and which 2 Bruce Nalgar was wounded, plus 1 other, and Tony Brading was killed. He was actually my good best friend in the army at that stage. He used to go on R&R together, and he took cover with a heavy barrel FN behind this mound, and on the other side of the mound was the Gook with a RPG. And apparently, what I got from Bruce is that they were actually swearing at Bruce's 5 guys, because they're all high on drugs, and they were actually on top of each other, meters away from each other. And Tony, unfortunately, got the RPG gunner who was already in position. He shot Tony from the head straight down his body, so his body was smashed to pieces with this RPG fire. It was horrible. But I was up on the side of the hill, and we heard the contact going, so we were all ready for anybody that was running away from the contact. And this one tour with the AK came rushing up this hill, and there was a whole lot of shale sticking out of the side of the hill. And Dave Parkin, who was one of my troopers, I just saw this barrel coming to the side of my ear like this. It was probably about 2 feet away. And he fired a shot, and he hit this about 30 yards away. He hit this Gook, but high up in the shoulder, okay, which must have gone, it did. In fact, the bullet went right through, but it knocked this Tur back on his heels down the hill, and his AK went sliding down. So I thought, oh, well, he's dead. And I went forward, and I told the guys to give me cover. And in the meantime, Steve Thackeray, who was Louis Thackeray's younger brother, he was a radio operator for me. And Sandy Miller, who was in another stock group, he was saying to them, he was a full corporal, I think. He was saying to him, try and get a capture. And in the meantime, I had gone to this top of the shale, and there this group was scrambling back down the hill to pick up his AK. And I shouted at him, and I said, hey, and he looked up at me. And typical RLI shooting practice, it was always a double tap. There was never a single round, and I double tapped him. He was so close, it actually made a hell of a mess of his head. And then Steve Thackeray said, on the radio, he said to Steve, he's just died. So, because Sandy Miller heard the shots from his stock group position. And anyway, it came out that he had just died. So I thought I was going to be in serious trouble for that. But nothing was said. I wasn't even debriefed about it. So, it was just another thing. But I was very unhappy that my friend, so many troublesome years, had been killed. Op Birch, in our contact anyway, that whole group, 21, what we got out of that contact was we landed up with the dinghy that which comes into the picture many years later, the dinghy that they crossed the Zambezi and the Hanyani with. We managed to get hold of that dinghy. It was a Russian dinghy blow-up thing. And we also managed to, I think it was Pete McNeilage, who was a lance corporal then, managed to get hold of an old German 7mm Mauser rifle, which was obviously a very prized sort of possession, with a very accurate, good, and used as a sniper's rifle in years gone by. So, yeah, there's a few spoils. And likewise, money seldom went back to SB or anything else like that. Every tour seemed to be broke when they picked him up. So I don't know where the money went, but carried quite some sums. But It's spoils of war, I suppose. I suppose after that, the rest was a few bits of border control. But the next major event was really Op Sable between 1970 and 1972. And this is an era that I cannot find many records on. But it was an era where the RLI I know was highly involved. A few months after the SAS entered Mozambique, because of the attack on Whistlefield Farm in 71, that whole area, northeast area, which became the hurricane area, in other words, one commando stomping ground, that area was so infested with gooks, and they were spread out all over the northeast of Rhodesia. It was actually an impossible mission to try and find them, because they had already set up their stores and they had already subverted the operation. And to me, one of the failures was internal affairs failures, that they didn't keep their ear to the ground close enough to know that this was happening. And it virtually happened in 1970 and before, under our very noses. And they infiltrated that area where they had caches all over the place. They already had their mujibas out and whatever. That was 1970, before they attacked Whistlefield Farm. They attacked Whistlefield Farm because they had the population already subverted. And our psyops were nowhere near it. And unfortunately, that, I think, to me personally, that was a bad mistake. But I'm not a general, so but it annoyed me that compared with the early days in the Sonoya Mangula area, SB had very close coverage with the ground, and the population actually used to report any signs of gooks and whatever. But in this area, you could ask anything, and there was nothing forthcoming. They wouldn't even ask. The local population wouldn't even answer you. They just ignore you. So it was not one could feel that this area had been subverted. So it came to, I think the Rhodesian army, regular army, woke up at that stage in 1971-72, because they realized that once the gooks had crossed the border, the Turs had crossed the border into Rhodesia, it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. They would be hidden by the population. They'd be fed and clothed and whatever by the population. So to get hold of them, they had pre-warning. They knew where you were. They even drove cattle through your ambush positions and things like that. You could even see the Mujiba standing there and then suddenly rushing off in some direction, obviously to go and report the fact that you're there. It was a real, around the centenary Mukumbura area and whatever. It was horrible to feel that you were in somebody else's territory. That you didn't have any control. So one commander at one stage, I can't remember the dates exactly because I never kept a journal. And I never took any photographs because at that stage we were told we were not allowed to. But obviously that rule got busted because a lot of people did take photographs and whatever. But it was, you weren't supposed to. And being an NCR, I was supposed to uphold the law, not go and break it. But the point was that it happened. And we were at Yamoussoukro Airstrip, where we set up a whole sort of, it was like a fire force base. But there was no fire force at the moment. But I was still in 2 Troop, and we were.
You'd been promoted to sergeant at this point, right?
Yes, I was promoted to sergeant then. Yes, and I was posted to 1 Troop. Sorry, and Neil Creel, who you know Neil Creel very well. He was very smart officer, but he was seldom around because he was a great rugby player, as you know, and a lot of his time I actually ran the platoon because he was obviously destined for higher things and obviously away on course a lot. So most of the time I spent with 13 guys in Mozambique in 1971. and 70 up to 72. I don't have the dates at hand because there's very little that was available. But from my point of view, we were based on the side of the hill. We even had guys, I know that Ron Rhodesia and a few guys, I think even Neil, they were involved with the Portuguese army on the Zambezi River. And they told us a tale about being there as liaison officers and whatever, with the Portuguese camps on the river. And this OC of the unit was cleaning his rifle. And he didn't do his safety procedures, and he let off a round and killed the cook. So all they did was he shouted some orders, and they grabbed the cook and threw him in the Zambezi River. And the major went around there. I think they mentioned major, if my memory serves me right. And they said, right, no, you the cook. They just grabbed the guy and said, now you the cook. And they had a pizza oven and clay and everything there. And that's a story I heard. So, yeah, those were the days when we had old Sport Edwards as our commando cook, a very big man. But what a cook. He could make a gourmet meal out of a rat pack, this guy. He was super. And when we used to come back by helicopter to land on the Nyamasoto Hill, I mean, it was over 750 meters above sea level. So you were flying in a valley. And we had one incident where we had been so far out into Mozambique, north up near Cabora Bassa. This was RLI now. And we came into the hill and we had no little fuel left, because to get to where we wanted, we had to make staging places where we had to build LCs on our foot patrols. We're using Cortex to knock down the bigger trees and whatever, and have fuel dumps to stage. We were doing that in 1971, 72. Anyway, we came into the escarpment, and the pilot, the lights went on and the beeper went off because they were warning him that he was short of fuel. But he still had to put it on full throttle because we were really loaded to get on top of the hill, to get up to the top onto the airstrip. And I think for the last 100 meters, I think he flew about 200 meters higher than the airstrip. But by auto gyration, he came into that airstrip in his chopper fully loaded. Now, that was some feat of flying, that boy, I can tell you. But I don't think the helicopter smelt too well. Anyway, so this was the fun, because the chopper pilots in Mozambique, they used to fly ridiculously low level, sort of treetop stuff. Anyway, one incident I had in Mozambique with my 13 guys, we were doing we had virtually no orders. You just had to go and search and find and gather, and so you were a sort of recce patrol and a fighting patrol if need be. So when we were at this place, I've forgotten the map, the grid reference on the map, and I couldn't tell you now where it was, because the maps in that area at that stage had grid lines on it. That was about it. They were really, really bad maps and very difficult to do any map reading. But somehow we managed to survive, because I think the worst thing about patrolling in Mozambique was, number one was water, and the other one was poor maps and the lack of intelligence. There was no intelligence in that area. Yeah, we were based on the slopes overlooking it was right, Nyamasoto was right on the border, as close as you could get to the border. And you could look out across the valley to this vast country. The one instance, we were doing this patrolling, and we came across a track that looked like what I called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, because it was obviously used by donkeys, and there was a few wheeled vehicles, which I thought were probably those mounted PPKs that Frelimo had. But it was obviously well used, and there was a knoll, a little hill on the side of this, and on the other side of this little hill was another track. So I decided with my 13 guys that we should ambush these two tracks because we could cover both of them with 13 guys. So we did a sort of all-round defense and ambush at the same time. And we set up everything else. We set up a few claymores and whatever, because now we're in Mozambique and we were totally unknown whether we were going to bump into Frelimo or whether we were going to bump into the Portuguese or even into or whatever, into ZANU cadres. So it was a very unknown situation. And to digress a bit, I was a little bit concerned because no matter what we did or whatever, there was never a debriefing. I, as a sergeant, was never really briefed about. I had no rules of engagement. I had very little debriefing, as though they knew what was going on. But I think it was probably a political thing because they didn't want the world to know that we were operating with the consent of the Portuguese. And the Portuguese didn't want the world to know that they allowed this Rhodesian troops into Mozambique, obviously, because they would bump into Fapler, which was sort of Portuguese domain. Anyway, we were on this thing, and around about 2 o'clock in the morning, we heard this hell of a noise, like a flippin' circus coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and I couldn't believe it. And the guys were all keen and whispering or whatever. The hill had very little rocks. It was just short but thick grass. Anyway, the patrol came, this lot came by us, and nobody opened fire because I refused to let anybody fire unless I fired first. So because I wanted to know what this was, what we were going to take on here. I had 13 guys. I was probably 200 or 300 kilometers away from base. I wasn't going to risk 13 guys' lives and be stormed by a whole battalion of Fapler. That's the way I was thinking. So I thought, no, just to shut up this time, and do nothing and let it go past. And that went and went and went, and they went down the hill over the hill, our hill, and down the hill into a valley, which was probably about 500 meters away, I guess. And they were blowing whistles and they were shouting in Portuguese, which confused everything anyway. And then one of the guys threw a grenade, and why, I don't know, and I don't want to go into that, but I was so annoyed because then all of a sudden silence, and these guys at the bottom, they started stonking hills around them with mortars because they didn't know where it had come from and where the explosion was. And I don't think they were even sure. I think they were so cocky, they thought it was probably their own people that had made an error, because they weren't very well that trained anyway, most of them. Because as you know, most of them it was cannon fodder, because the first time a lot of the Gooks only saw a weapon is when they were going to cross the border into Rhodesia. Other than that, it was all sticks and whatever. So anything could have happened. But we stayed quiet, and there was a lot of shouting and whatever. But they lit the grass because it was short, dry, but very thick. And I said to the guys, take your smocks off and pour your water bottle onto the smock. And when the fire comes up to you, just push it out like that and put out the fire in front of you. Because it wasn't that dispersed area, and it could not have got more than a couple of feet in height, the flames. So I thought, well, this was the idea. Fortunately, the fire went out before it really got going, so we didn't have to do that. But we were ready for that eventuality, because they had lit up the whole area. The whole area was on bloody fire. Anyway, I got to we had a TR-28 long-range radio. I managed to get hold of the boss, who then was Roy Makovich, and I said to him that, we're in this predicament. We didn't know what he wanted us to do about it, because we were so far away. And we were all briefed on how short patrol choppers were and trackers and that type of thing were. So it wasn't my decision, I felt. He needed to tell me what I needed to do. Did I need to follow up the slot on my own? but we didn't have proper trackers, so we could have buggered it all up. But anyway, when the helicopters, he sent in the helicopters the next morning to collect us. It was 3 helicopters, and they came, and when we saw them coming over the horizon, I really had tears in my eyes, because I thought, the responsibility of 13 guys in that sort of situation in your hands is something that a very young guy doesn't really want. But you're given, and you have to make the best of it. So we were choppered out of there. Another patrol we did in Mozambique is we came across this huge camp. It had a hospital in it, all up a re-entrant. It had a central point where the sort of central meeting area was. It had an officer's mess. It had everything. And up the re-entrance all around it. At the end of all the re-entrance, they had satellite camps where there was places for 6, 7 people to sleep. So if you attacked, you were likely to bump into one of the satellite camps before you got into the main camp, and therefore you could, I suppose, evacuate, and that satellite camp would act as a stop group to buy time to evacuate the camp. That's all I could assume. Anyway, that night we got in a plowshare, and we loaded up with rocks and bolts and nuts and whatever. We got it sent out to us, and we put this thing up and on a tripwire or whatever, and left and came back to Nyamasotho airstrip. And the camp, we thought, was not too far away from the border, in fact. I think they called it Sigaranza 2. Anyway, we were sitting on the side, and in the evening sometime, an explosion reached our ears, and we looked out, and there was all this black dust and smoke to the north of us. So we thought that must be the plowshare being tripped. So the next day we went in there, and we found a hell of a mess. No bodies, but the foliage and everything had been, the sort of road had been cleared right through the center of this camp. So, we did have some sort of nasty weapons at our disposal, but it was all rudimentary stuff. The other instance I had is we saw a whole gang. I don't know how many they were, but we came across this, like a flay open countryside that had no grass. It was just clay, all cracked, like a dry riverbed. But it was about 2 kilometers wide. And you had to be careful when you crossed it, because it was like walking on stepping stones, because a guy could put his foot in a fissure and break his leg very easily. And we were on the one side, and then through we saw movement on the other side of the flame. And we looked through the binos, and there was these guys in military style kit going like this to us and everything. So they had seen us. And the natural thing for the RLI guys to do was to run at the enemy. That was an RLI thing, totally aggressive. And I said no, because I was scared. The guys would have broken their legs by the time they had got there, and it wasn't worth it. So we'd stood there, and they disappeared into the bush, but they were about 2 kilometers away. I even thought about putting the machine gun at the highest trajectory I could, at 45-degree angle, and having a good squirt at them with this to try and bomb them with bullets. Gave up on that idea. So once again, it was really fleeting, and the population hid away from any military guys, any guys carrying weapons. They hid away from, because eventually we sat in this camp, and I remember I was feeding some of these village dogs with some bully beef, these young puppies, and the one guy came very slowly out of the bush, and he could speak perfectly English, and he said, what can he help us? And I said, well, where's all your people? All the grain bins were full of mealy cobs and whatever. And he said, no, whenever they see a patrol, because if Frelimo come, they abuse all our women and they eat all our food. If the Portuguese army come, they abuse all our women and eat all our food. Now you come, we thought we were going to abuse our women and eat all our food. So it gave you an indication that the civilian population just didn't have a flipping chance. And that really sunk into me and brought home the stupidity of this whole exercise, because there was only one side that really suffered and died for that, their freedom, and that was the people themselves.
Yeah.
It was rather sad for me to hear that. But eventually it all came back in. And there was an instance where we picked up a letter nailed to the side of a tree, which said, "Go back home, Boers." They called us Boers. And they were obviously Frelimo or something like that. "This is not your fight. Go back home." So they knew we were in that area. They knew we were there. And all I can say is that the information that came out of there, with the lack of debriefing and whatever, could only be political. Because if we had acted on the information that I had about marking in where water holes were and where the likely of depot vines and things like that, and little forest areas and whatever, I marked those on bland maps that just had, as I say, just had contour lines. So that is about all my experience in Mozambique.